Recording, I guess. Perfect. So it's already recording. And off to you, Nalini.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. This is Nalini Elkins. I'm the president of Industry Network Technology Council. Welcome to our webinar on AIPREF at the IETF. We're so glad to have Suresh Krishnan, who is one of the chairs of this area group. It's a new work at the IETF. Suresh has a great background in so much of the IETF. He's chaired many groups and has over 40 RFCs in multiple IETF areas. He's also a member of the Internet Architecture Board. He is at Cisco right now. He's just one of the IETF stalwarts that we're so glad to have. Off to you, Suresh, and thank you so much. By the way, if you have any questions, please do put them in the question window and we will get to them. There will be a question and answer period at the end as well. Off to you, Suresh.
Thank you. Thanks, Nalini. Thanks for the intro, and thanks everyone for showing up. And so I think I'm going to start off with like a small disclaimer. So I'm not like making this presentation on behalf of the working group or the IETF or the IAB. So just like a lot of this is like personal views, and a lot of the stuff is actually things that are in progress. So like a lot of the things I say might change like very quickly because it's a very early days of the working group. So don't think of any of what I say as binding. Think of it as more as like background work that kind of has happened and what's happening. And I would really look forward for people to participate on the list and join the working group meetings if you can. So thank you. And as like Nalini said, I'm one of the chairs of the working group. The other chair is like Mark Nottingham from Cloudflare, who's like my co-chair. So he's got like more of the legal and regulatory background on this than me. So I'm like fairly a technical person, and he is technical too, but he has like a little bit more of the like a legal background on this. So I'll just start off with like a quick agenda. So I'm going to start off with the background. So how did this work get started off, and why did it get started off, and why IETF, and those kind of things. And we'll like start off with that, talk about what is the scope of the working group, and what are the major discussion points that have happened in the near like past and happening currently, and what can happen in the near future as well. And talk about some of the deliverables that the working group is going to do, and then kind of open up for questions. I really want to run through the presentation quickly and have more discussions and questions if possible, but let's see how that goes. So with a quick background, so what has happened is there's like a lot of regulation that's ongoing around the world, right? Like people realize there's all these AI companies and they are like training models on the open web. So there's companies like that have put content on the open web, assuming that like they can be used for like search and for like like describing things and like to get traffic back to them that they can monetize in some way. And also like people who put in like protected works, right? Like art and music and stuff. And they were like kind of not exactly sure like how these things are getting used afterwards, like once it goes on the web. So the idea was like to figure out how the people who create the content or like host the content, right? So this is like both for content creators as well as like platforms that host the content, how would they let the AI crawlers, scrapers know what are the things they're allowed to do with it, right? Like that. So we start off as like something called AI control, like how do you control these things? And then we realize like it's really not something that we can control, but it's more about expressing preferences. So I would say the most further along regulation is mainly coming from the EU, right? Like so the EU Data Act has like quite a bit of stuff on data mining, and there's also a specific opt-out clause in there saying that you can actually opt out people from like mining your stuff if you provide like a machine readable description of like what you're opting out of. So that kind of led to a bunch of things. So everybody kind of started doing their own thing, how they're like telling the AI crawlers to go away. So we realized like there's probably some kind of standard needed, even though that like, the different stakeholders, the AI platforms, like OpenAI or Meta, like, and all those people who do AIs, the content platforms, like, YouTube, or like, the like Facebook or something like that, like, anybody who, or Reddit, right? And they have like different set of goals, and the content creators, like the people who make the videos that go on there, they might have like different set of views. But I think it's in everybody's interest to have like one standard to do like how do we express this preference? Because without that, the current situation is that every kind of site has its own way of expressing how it wants to do AI opt-out. They say like, oh, like, they have some extensions only they understand, right? And they say like any crawler that comes here needs to understand my thing. And same way that each of the crawlers decided like, hey, this is how you can opt out from my crawling. So the Bing crawler from Microsoft, or the Google crawler, or the OpenAI crawler, they say, hey, if you want to opt out of AI training, like do this, right? And then there's all these other companies like coming in, like, DeepSeek or Anthropic, they all come in and they all try to specify their own way of opting out from their crawling, right? So this is like, obviously you see this as like a combinatorial explosion that really doesn't work, right? Because we start having an n-square kind of problem, and probably more than an n-square problem. So we just said, okay, let's get a set of stakeholders to come talk, right? And one thing you should know about the IETF is, right, it's open and transparent, right? And like everything we do is like, there's like video recordings of it, there's minutes, like everything everybody said is attributed. And we realized that this doesn't work for a lot of these initial discussions. So people were not willing to go on record with a lot of the things if they were going to be public and attributable, right? So so the IETF has like no way of doing this, right? Like we cannot have like a private meeting of an IETF working group or a BOF, like that doesn't have everything in the open, right? Like completely transparent. So we decided to have an IAB workshop. So the IAB workshop can have different set of rules. In our case, we decided to use a modified Chatham-House rule, which means that we will try to document everything that happened there, but there's going to be no attribution. So whatever somebody said in the meeting, we can figure out what it is, but we cannot go out and say who said that, right? Or like claim that, oh, like Google said this, right? Like, so, or like such and such from Google said that. So like the IAB workshop gave us like a mechanism of doing something under like a much more controlled circumstance, which allowed people to be more open. Because like the first step of the process was we wanted to figure out if people would be willing to be open with their problems and their like positions and stuff and so on. So that's like something we really wanted to get out. So we had a in-person workshop in Washington, DC last September. So this was like, so we had like some people in the program committee, and like we looked at stuff. Dhruv, like you were doing some of the reviews as well, right? Like, so the idea is like we went through a set of position papers. So in order to participate and get an invitation, you needed to have an accepted position paper. Okay, so like we had a bunch of collected position papers explaining, like we had an extremely really like wide set of stakeholders like doing it, right? So the content creators, the platforms, the crawlers, the AI platforms, and civil society. And we also had quite a bit of government and regulators too, right? Like even though some of them did not want to be mentioned, we did have people, we did allow people to be opted out from being listed as participating. So, and some people did actually take that option to say like, we don't want to be listed as participating. So we did have that option too. So we did have quite a bit of representation across the spectrum from different like parts of the community. So everybody kind of gets to talk about the views. So for an example, right, like, Wikimedia participated in it, right? Like, the Common Crawl participated in it. So like we would see quite a bit of nonprofits and civil society participation, like CDT, for example. So we would kind of get like a wide sort of participation, so we could have this like really, really good discussion. And we did that. So we had like an extremely good set of discussions in there. And there is a workshop report that's available you can look at. So it's in the AI control workshop page, which I put up there. So you can actually go and look it up. It's somewhere at the end. I don't want to talk about the report itself, but you can read the report. And if you have questions, come back to me or like, send a mail to the list. We can kind of have the discussions afterwards. But part of the thing was like, we kind of identified like what are the issues that are solvable by us. So the bottom line was to figure out So think of it as like kind of a BOF, right? Because we are trying to figure out, is there a problem for us to solve? And in the IETF side, is the problem solvable? And like, what is the scope of the problem we can solve? So we kind of did that work in the workshop. And since we kind of had a really good answer at the end of it, which is again in the workshop report, but part of it is like we started writing down like what are the problems we want to solve. And then we went straight to our AD at that point, which was Zahed. And to talk about like how we can actually get this work charted, right? Because the timeline was fairly short, and I'll talk a little bit about it, but the idea was to have something usable by August this year. So like, if you've seen like an IETF working group timeline, it doesn't look like a typical IETF working group timeline. We plan to at least like take a shot at meeting the milestones, right? So we wanted to have something workable, getting out of the working group by August this year. So we wanted to have a working group done by like early this year. So we started we had a side meeting in Dublin to kind of like narrow down on the scope of the workshop. So at the end of the workshop, we had like stuff we didn't want to do. And then we spent some time in Dublin at a side meeting to figure out like what are the deliverables we want to work on, like what are the things we didn't want to work on, to kind of work on the charter scope itself, right? And then we shipped it off to the AD. And after like a couple of iterations, we managed to get the working group chartered in Jan. So this is like already, you see like a really, really fast process, like where we had something done very, very quickly. So the idea is to make like the IETF a little bit more adaptable to do things quickly when the market kind of deserves it, right? Because at this point, if we don't do a standard here in this space, there'll be like governments which will be doing the standards, right? Like because the EU is gonna ask for something, and maybe some private company or a private consortium or some other set of people will write something that may not be necessarily in the interest of the open internet. So it's in our interest to kind of come up with something that different governments of the world can get behind, right? That's kind of why we are like doing this like really, really quickly. That means like we do take some shortcuts in the process. Like, we adopted a document like very, very quickly, right? I'll talk about it a little bit, but like that means that like, sometimes like the rough consensus calls are like a little bit rougher than usual, right? Like because we kind of want to make progress. So we are trying to do stuff that is really like bare minimum, right? So we're not looking for complexity. We are trying to do the simpler solution most of the time, do minimal solutions is like kind of what I'm going for, and leave extensibility for later, right? Like, so that's at least the high level thinking behind the working group right now. We had our first meeting in Bangkok in the IETF, and we also had an interim meeting in Brussels. So one of the things was like we were trying to reach regulators from like different areas, right? So the first one was in DC to kind of get the US regulators, and like now we had the second one like close to the EU regulators. So we had like people from the EC call in, right? Like into the meeting, they were like not allowed to come to the physical meeting place. It was Microsoft was hosting it, and then we had a bunch of people call in and like propose the things like over the phone, right? Like over Meet Echo. So it was a proper Meet Echo session, and they were like actually doing quite a bit of engagement into the working group process. So we are kind of, and we had people from Japan. So like, so stuff like that, right? Like, so we had quite a bit of people coming in producing, and I'd love to see some kind of representation from the Indian government or the ministries, right? Like, in charge of this, to see like how this fits in, right? Because we already noticed, right? Even with this like few jurisdictions, right? Like with US, UK, EU and Japan, we realize like things are like really, really different between them even, right? So because in Japan, right, like you can pretty much take anything and train, right? Like the law itself clearly says like, hey, you can do these things, right? Because they passed a law that like, you can copy packets on the wire. So the same thing kind of applies here, right? Like, so if I'm paraphrasing, so I can actually send you the code to read it. It's translated, but it says like, hey, you can do whatever, like with stuff you send over the network. That's kind of a high level thing. But like we realize like the regimes are like very, very different. So we need to do something that is very flexible for much other things. So we want to do something simple, but we also do want to do something flexible, right? Because like to meet different kind of regimes. Any questions till now? I cannot see the thing. So like Dhruv or Nalini, if you can.
No questions so far. I think we can continue.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So what's in scope? So what we want to do is like describe a vocabulary for expressing AI-related preferences, right? Like, and the idea would be, so when people talk about like vocabulary, what they mean is like, hey, can I use this for training, right? Can I use this for inference, right? Can I use this for search crawling, for search indexing, right? That's kind of the high level kind of things we are looking at. But we also realized there's like additional complications. Because like one of the assumptions we had going in here was that like, people who crawl the content use the content, right? That's something we kind of all assume without knowing this ecosystem, right? Imagine OpenAI wanted something, right? They would go crawl like your site, like let's say like INTC.net or anything, right? They go and crawl it and they kind of pull the things off, right? But we realize there's like also like different parts of the ecosystem. There's this group called Common Crawl. They're fascinating, right? So what they do is like instead of like everybody going and crawling the stuff, they go and crawl the web and they give you like the crawl data sets so they can actually reduce the load on the server. So the Common Crawl crawls these things and then you can get the Common Crawl data set, right? So this is like a nonprofit and they're doing this stuff. But then it became like harder to do because like the person who crawls is not the person who uses it. So we potentially need to expand the vocabulary to say, hey, if you crawl, how do we actually transitively pass this on, right? So that's like some additional complications we started discovering when we had like a larger set of stakeholders in there. But that's kind of where like we are right now. So we wanted to express the vocabulary for being able to like do like a more complex set of things, but still pretty minimal. And there's also people who want to do things like, hey, like I'm willing for you to take this, but I kind of want you to talk to my licensing department. So like, do we want to go do something about that or not, right? So we kind of decided we're not going to do this in the first like iteration of the deliverables, but it's something we want to leave extensible for people to look at, right? Because it's not a clear no, but it's something that's like more nuanced than that, and we cannot really handle too much nuance here. And one of the other things which was very interesting was there's like companies like Financial Post or like things like that, right? Who would, or like even BBC, right? Like they're fine with taking the articles, like as long as you give back the traffic to them, right? You can do the AI training, but like as long as they get back the traffic to them. But if you summarize, right? Or if you change the headline, they're not happy with it, right? Imagine like, you crawl the article from somewhere and you kind of summarize it and put in a new headline, right? Imagine if something said like, oh, like, Dhruv has been appointed chair of SRV6 Ops, and then it says like, imagine if something says like, oh, routing dude becomes like operator, whatever, right? Like, if the article itself kind of gets morphed and re-represented, they're not happy with it. So like, these are the kind of things that are pretty complex to express, right? And then we have to kind of make like categories of these things, which say like, hey, this is kind of how we want our content to be used. And some people say, hey, I don't want this to be used for military purposes, right? Like, no, I don't want my content to be used for training like military things, right? Like, but not, I'm okay for other things. And some people say, I don't mind like non-commercial, but like, I don't want it to be used for commercial purposes, right? And it's like fascinating, like how many things are in here. So if you try to look up what non-commercial means, it's extremely complex. There's like a 20-page paper on like, when people are trying to survey what non-commercial means. I can probably share this link with you, like for the people on there. It's like a fascinating read because like Creative Commons actually has like a non-commercial license, but there's no definition of non-commercial. So they're actually trying to survey to find out like what people understand when they grant a non-commercial license, right? So, so those kind of things are like very, very complex, but we are trying to accommodate like all these kind of things in the vocabulary if possible, right? Like, so we try to keep it simple, but allow like extensibility for people to do like a little bit more in the future if needed, because the settings are like pretty complex, like once you go inside. And once we do this, then we need to express this. Once we have a common vocabulary, we need to attach it to content somehow, right? Like, so this could be sitting on a web server. So where you can say like, hey, everything in this directory is like this kind of like vocabulary, right? I say like no AI training, or it's okay for like inference and stuff and so on, or it could be inside a file. So you could have a video file, and the video file could have like embedded metadata, which says the same thing. So we kind of wanted to have the same vocabulary for all these things, right? Because like we don't want to be able to have like different kind of vocabularies for different things. And because the next point is the last one, right? Is where like we need to reconcile all these things. So imagine, right, you had like something coming from a web server, right? You go crawl something, you see a robots.txt file there, which tells you something, and then it comes over a HTTP, you grab that over a HTTP connection, the header tells you something, and then the actual content, the encoded content in there, it's a video or a picture, which tells you something else, right? So how do you reconcile all these things? So this is something, this is still active work, right? And there's different ways of doing this, right? Because the easiest two things, right? Like is one of them could be the most specific one, right? Like, so you always look at the most specific expression of preference, right? That's one way to do it. And the other ones is probably like most restrictive, right? You just say, look at all of these things and think whatever is the most restrictive and take it, right? So that's like still ongoing work. So we don't have a document yet, like for doing this, but like this is something we want to address, because like if we don't have this specified, people could just say like, hey, I looked at it and the video didn't have anything in there. So like, I'm just going to assume it's all okay, right? So if we don't specify the way of combining the preferences in a way that's standard, then all these things, people could just take whatever they want, which is not something we wanted to do. And we clearly, from the IETF, there's a saying, it says the IETF is not the protocol police, and we continue on that path, right? We are not the protocol police. So we cannot do any technical enforcement of the preferences. There are companies that are starting up, like especially in the EU for doing this. They're kind of like looking at doing some kind of queries to see when this file was seen. So because one of the things that we don't actually talk about in the IETF, right, is how it's getting used. And a key complication is the timing of use. So imagine if Nalini had something on her site, right, which says like, okay, like I'm fine with using this for everything, okay? And then you go train your model, and 3 months later, Nalini decides like, oh, I don't want to use like all my photos for training, like, AI videos, right? And then she changes her robots.txt to say like, no, right? But what is the implication of people who crawled our site before, right? Like, is this something, how do we enforce it? Or how do we enforce that? Imagine some crawler went and saw Nalini saying, I don't want this, and they still crawled it anyway, right? And they put it in the model. Like, how do we know that somebody looked at it, right? So all these kind of things are like outside the IETF scope, but there is like people who are looking at it. Like, how do we actually have some kind of query service, like, and mark that you saw that thing and you complied, right? That's something that's like outside the scope of IETF. So we're not the protocol police, we kind of stick to that, but people outside will look at it, right? And how do you authenticate like the bots, right? Like, so when somebody tells, if you say like, hey, I don't mind if like Google gets my thing, but I don't want OpenAI to get it, right? So how do you actually verify that Google is Google? Like somebody claims to be a Google crawler is a Google crawler, right? Like, so that's something that's outside. There's like some stuff ongoing with the bot authentication, but it's something that's outside the scope of this working group, right? And there's also people who are actually putting up like registries of content, right? They make like a content ID, and then you query the central registry to see if you can crawl it or not, or train it, right? Like, so some piece of video, right? Imagine there's like a API or like a Reuters video that's somewhere. The video will have some kind of perceptual hash and some content on it, and then you query a registry to see if you can do it, right? Which means that somebody cannot just take a video. Imagine like, Dhruv had a video, and like you crawl it, right? And remove his metadata, put in a new metadata, and then you can allow it to crawl, right? Like, so those kind of things can be fixed by like having a hash of the content itself, some kind of content identification that will give you the permissions to do stuff. So those kind of things are like really out of scope. Any question?
Vinayak, do you want to ask your question, or otherwise I can read it out as well?
Go ahead.
You can read it out. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so Vinayak asked a question first related to, are there any creative folks and civil society folks involved in the working group?
Civil society for sure, like creative folks, not so much, right? Like, it's really the more of the platforms doing it, right? Rather than actual creative folks. I did reach out to like, Hank Green and John Green, the Green brothers, like who are doing some other stuff, but they didn't get back, right? Like, so I kind of, like Mark and I both reached out to some content people, but like a lot of the platform people are there, but civil society for sure. So I don't know if you know like Farzaneh Balay from like Open Medusa, she's there, like quite a bit of folks from CDT, like, Mallory participates, Nick participates, quite a few people from civil society are there for sure.
And Vinayak also has a question on the complexity of the parser. Like, since we have all these different types of references, how do we handle the complexity of the parser in this case? Would it be too complex?
The goal is not to be. So we do have a 0-0 working group document. I have a link at the end, right? The goal is to make it like very simple. I can kind of leave the complexity out for later, like for a later stage, because we don't even know what are the other things we need to do. So it's simpler. And the goal is to do this, at least the first step, right? The attachment, like the location-based attachment as an extension to robots.x or the robots exclusion protocol, which is little slightly different than that, right? Like, the rep stuff, you can look it up, RFC 9309. The goal is to actually have it as an extension of that. There is an open source thing that like Google has, like, so you can actually look at it. Like I don't have a link in this presentation, but I can share it with you and that like, you can actually look at it. And there's also ways for that to actually collect information about like what didn't comply. So you can actually see that like, there's parsers like that didn't understand something. There's ways to actually report back those kind of statistics as well from there. So the goal, like at a high level, is to keep it simple so it doesn't add to the complexity. But there is like open source parser for that. Like whatever we do, we'll continue putting it in there.
Priyanka also notes that she does not see a lot of AI experts in this conversation at the working group. Do you see that as a problem or something? Any thoughts on that?
So for the work, so a lot of them like have participated in the workshop. So Priyanka, like you had a position paper too, right? Like, so a lot of this thing happened in the workshop because they don't want to go on record. A lot of the people, like, because there's like they're in a place where they can probably not openly comment, right? But we do have people from like OpenAI and Meta like looking at these things at least, and Google at least looking at this and kind of being silent on it. So we hope that we will hear from them if we do something totally wrong in here, right? But lot of these things have input from them, at least from the workshop. So if you look at it, you will see the people represented in there. So like we have people from like Anthropic, OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, right? Which is kind of the big, I would say, set of players in here. We would love to see, somebody from DeepSeek can show up, right? Like, like all the other models that are kind of getting built, right? We did try to reach out to as many of them as possible, but a lot of them did not want to comment in the open. It's like, I think it's the industry itself. Like, maybe they have regulatory pressures. We don't exactly know. I can only speculate, right? But a lot of them would not put these things in the open in the working group. But I'm sure that if we have something in there that doesn't meet their requirements or it's too constraining for them, I'm sure we'll hear about it.
Yeah. Thanks, Suresh. We can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so to your point, right? Again, like, we wanted to make sure the vocabulary should be simple. And the idea is to have very, very minimal vocabulary, right? Like, because as I said before, right, there's two things. If you have too many things, like, it becomes very complex for somebody to implement when they actually read it, right? So like, we're kind of thinking like yes, no, and maybe in one more thing, right? Like for some purposes, right? Like that's kind of where we are going to stop. And the other thing is really like we had to combine these things across multiple attachment locations, right? Like as I talked about the server, the container, and the transport, right? Like, so all those things need to get combined. So we want to have very minimal set of things so it becomes easy to combine these things, right? And we want it to be extensible, so which means that we don't close off anything, but we really don't want to start with a big set of things to implement in the vocabulary. So we want it to be very, very simple. So like keeping the parser simple is one thing, but like making sure that's implementable. Because if people say like, oh, I'm fine with this being used for educational research, but not if it's going to be for like, war or like, like effects of this on like, I don't know, like children or whatever like that. So those kind of things are certainly possible because people do want to express those things, but we cannot address those in the initial phase because otherwise we'll be actually sitting down and discussing this forever, right? Like no boiling the ocean. And also some of the things are actually protected by law. So for example, the EU regulation says, if you're doing this for like fundamental research, you can ignore the preferences, right? So imagine you say like, I don't want this to be crawled and somebody's doing this for research purposes, like for like some researcher in some university in like Slovakia is doing it, there's nothing you can do about it because they have the legal right to crawl granted to them by the government. And that's kind of part of stuff that's outside this, right? So we want to keep it simple, but also like allow like different regulatory regimes to do different things, right? So we are not trying to do the regulatory framework on this. So we want to be able to express a preference, but also allow this to exist in multiple kind of regimes. And the I talked about the attachment mechanism, right? Like pretty much by URL, right? Like this is the robust text, and people are doing this for search, right? Like the goal of, so I think like one thing I wanted to call out, this is like a very, very interesting piece of information from a position paper. This came from Ted Hardy's position paper. Why did people obey robust text, right? So imagine, right, if a site tells you like, don't crawl my site, go away, right? Why did the crawlers obey it? And on the other side, like, why would somebody want the stuff to be crawled? So one of the things that was interesting was that the search engine and the site had like a mutually beneficial relationship, right? So the search engine gets like a lot of sites, it gets like more popular, but the site also got back traffic and attention, right? Like, so that was like one kind of thing that kind of worked pretty well on the web, because like you give your content to be crawled by Google, and like, Google kind of gave you traffic back, right? Which you can either like monetize or like whatever you want to do with your content. You put it out there so people can read it, benefit from it, and maybe you can benefit. You probably have ads or you have a subscription, whatever, something that you could gain from too. But with a lot of these like AI training, that kind of goes away, right? Because you're not getting back the attention, you're not getting back the traffic. So like what's really in it for them? So that's kind of the big difference between like crawling for the web and crawling for AI, because you may not get pretty much anything back, right? So it's really about the openness of the web itself. So so that's kind of why, like, we are kind of trying to build on top of the success of like robust text, like REP. But like, there's also other things we need to do. Could be like HTTP header fields, like maybe the next set of things, right, where we put in things, maybe like, link relations and stuff and so on. And also stuff we don't control, which I'll go into in a second. So this is like the other piece, right? Like there's some stuff, if you want to put stuff in HTML or in like MPEG-4 or JPEG, this is not IETF that does it, right? Like, so this has to be some other organization which decides like how to put it in their formats, and also voluntarily decide to obey the vocabulary we came up with, right? That's kind of part of the thing, like the IAB, like Dhruv and I are in the IAB. Dhruv used to be in the liaison coordination too. So we have a liaison coordination role for the IETF, and we talk to these other bodies. So the idea would be like, when we come up with something quick and simple, so when we try to do this like very quickly, we get ahead of all the other standards bodies who are trying to work on this, and we do something simple that's working for them. We hope that they're all out of the same kind of vocabulary. So it becomes like we don't have to map between different things and their meanings, right? Because if the video used like a different vocabulary for expressing it, then we have to somehow figure out how to combine, or not we, but somebody who's crawling needs to combine all these things. So we kind of want to have the same kind of understanding of like what the semantics mean for this, right? So that we are kind of trying to get out of this, talk to the other liaison bodies as well that we have to work with. And the other piece is really the opt-in versus opt-out. So this is something we clearly see as a divide. This is not going to be a unifying thing around the world. So there's like a lot of regimes that are going to be opt-in. A lot of them, they're going to be opt-out, which means that like the opt-in is like you need to explicitly say that I'm okay with my content being crawled. Otherwise, it's like you're seen as not granting permission. And the opt-out is like unless you say something clearly in a machine readable format, you're assumed to have opted in by just putting it on the web, right? Like, so this is going to be at least like a high level, like how the world is going to go, right? Like, opt-in or opt-out regimes. It could be like more nuanced than that, but at least at a high level, we need to understand what the lack of signal means, right? And we decided in the working group, we will not define what the lack of signal means, okay? Which means that like it falls to the regulatory framework. If you don't have an expression of interest, what it means. So if you ask me which regulatory regime, where you're hosting it, where you're crawling it, good question. It's not our answer. It's something that probably get hashed out in a court of law somewhere, right? Because you could be in a different regime crawling than where the content is being made and content is being hosted. So this is like something that's not a technical question for us. So we decided like we will not address it. Any questions still now?
There's a question from Priyanka. Priyanka, do you want to go and ask that question as well? I can allow you. You are. One second. I think. Let me just try again. Priyanka, yeah. Priyanka, you want to ask the question?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Priyanka.
Yeah, Suresh, so you said that because of the formats of the data like MPEG and JPEG and other things, the working group is not defining any vocabulary for these kind of content, right?
Not the attachment. We want to define the vocabulary that's common for everything, but not the attachment. Like we wouldn't specify how this vocabulary could be used inside a metadata of a MPEG.
Right. So the point is what I'm trying to understand only is that textual data, right? Textual or whatever, the HTML and other things, they are used to train large language models, right? LLMs that your Anthropic and all this OpenAI everybody uses and builds. But
Mhm.
there's a large push in this area of which there are a few early models, but no generalized solutions for visual large language models, right? The ones which have a even greater application area, such as autonomous driving and all kinds of other things. So by doing this, by not applying these preferences to visual and audio and image, like basically those how like you're restricting text and not restricting audio and visual and image, or like how is it, like is it going to be like, are you unrestricting one and restricting the other? Because that
No, no,
would
no.
depend on the, that would make a difference, that would make a difference to people who are currently developing these models, like people like Samsung, right? People
Yeah.
like Mitsubishi, Merl, and Samsung Research America. These people are actually building these VLLMs at this moment.
Yeah.
So, but they're not in this conversation. So I don't know, does this impact them at all?
So I just want to make sure, like, I clarify one thing, Priyanka. Like, if what you said is true, that's bad, right? But that's not what we're doing. Okay. So we are saying the vocabulary for preferences applies across these things, but we will not define how they are expressed, right? So because in the IETF, what we can do is we can only look at our protocols and our formats, right? So we say, like, if you're expressing these preferences in a robust or text file, this is how it's going to look like, right? So that's something we do. And our goal is, like, we communicate this, the vocabulary document gets communicated to the other bodies, and they'll say, like, okay, like if there's a video, right, like that you're training on with the visual LLM, right? You'll say, like, imagine if there's like an MPEG for video, you need to look in this part of the metadata of the container and look for this preference. So our goal is that the preference is actually expressed there as well. And it actually means exactly the same thing as it was expressed in robust text. So, like, our explicit goal is to be able to do that, to be applicable to multiple formats, but we won't define how it is expressed. Does that make sense?
Kind of. Thanks, Suresh and Dhruv.
We also have Nalini's hands up. Nalini, you go ahead and ask a question.
I don't want to distract too much, Suresh, on this, but what Priyanka brings up is an excellent point for so many reasons. I mean, is it because some of this actually applies to like people uploading pictures of their kids on Facebook, and I think this is a crazy area. I mean, I was just doing something the other day, and it ended up finding a picture of my one of my daughters, and I'm like, what? Seriously. So anyway, I don't want to distract, but this is a huge area.
No, but for sure, Nalini, it's not a distraction. This is something we do think about, right? So what I'll tell you what I think is ideally should happen, right? Let's see if we make that work, right? So what we do is we finish off the vocabulary document, right? And the vocabulary says, like, don't train. Okay. So we, like, let's say, imagine don't train is like set, right? We come up with a name for it. It says do not train, do not use this for AI training, do not use this for Gen AI or whatever that thing is going to be, right? So what happens is that vocabulary gets communicated to the some ISO, like TC, right? Like somewhere, right? Which is defining the JPEG format. Okay. So the idea would be, like, we pass this on, and then, like, the JPEG format has a placeholder for this preference. So when you upload this picture, like using your like iPhone or whatever, that metadata bit is going to get set saying that don't train. And somebody who's crawling this on Facebook, right? So Facebook is going to say like, oh, you can use, if you're a meta crawler, you can use this for everything, right? That's what's going to happen. Obviously, they're going to do that, right, for the platform. So they'll say yes, and your JPEG that you uploaded of your daughter's pictures is going to say no. And if, again, this is like not done in the working group yet, if we decide that the most restrictive preference applies, then people don't use it for training. This is the ideal chain of things, if that makes sense, Nalini. This could go wrong in multiple ways, but this is at least what we're trying to do. So to make this possible. Right now, this doesn't exist.
No, that's great. That's great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Suresh, I had one related question. Like these days, when we see even things like Google, when we are even doing Google search, there is an AI box that comes on top. So would we consider a Google search crawler, which is these days also doing AI, as just a search crawler or an AI crawler? Would that kind of confusion exist? Is that something that came up?
So yes, absolutely. So like the person who's doing the crawler for Google is there, right? Like, so they're identifying themselves differently for like crawling for this for AI stuff and not. And again, this isn't the purpose, right? So if you're going to use it for Gen AI, then somebody could say no, right? That's part of the purpose of the vocabulary, right? You don't use this for Gen AI, right? Somebody could just say, don't use it for Gen AI. Like, as I said, like this is a work in progress, like how granular are we going to go, right? But somebody could be fine with AI training, but not for Gen AI, right? Like, and there's like talk about stylish things, right? So some people could say, like, imagine you're an artist, Dhruv, right? Or like you draw something, you're fine with your thing getting used, but like not being invoked as make a picture of the Independence Day parade in the style of Dhruv, right? Is not something they want. So like there's like quite a bit of complexity in there, but yes, there is a difference between indexing, crawling for search and crawling for AI and crawling for something that's called RAG. So RAG is really like more like an inference thing, because it's really like actually calling your thing to get like citations or whatever for the query it made, or like a response it made. So like they are like all considered different things from the vocabulary perspective.
Awesome. I think we are ready to move forward.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so this is like, again, so some of the content holders wanted to put in some kind of licensing schemes in there. So if you, so one of the key players in here is like, there's quite a few of them, right? There's BBC is like one of them. Sky was another one of them. Universal, they're all like in this space, right? So they say, hey, like I kind of also want to say like, hey, this is like, I want to put in some kind of licensing stuff in here, saying like, hey, like this is fine, and I want you to use it under this kind of licensing, or come talk to my licensing person about how you want to use it, right? We decided we're not going to do this like in the initial iteration, but it's something we want to consider for extensibility. So the answer is most likely going to be like yes, no, and potentially something like talk to me or something like that, right? But we don't know that yet, right? Like how it's going to look like, but like there's potential for extensibility because it seems to be a common thing for a lot of the content providers, the large ones, not like, you know, common people like you, me, right? But the people who have like large amount of content, like movies and music and stuff, they potentially want to be able to have some kind of licensing thing that the bots understand and can probably do some kind of automated contracts or anything, or that's something that's potentially in the works in the future, but not right now. Okay, so like we are getting close to the end here. Like, so part of it is like, I think Priyanka, this is probably like a lot of interest to you, right? Like part of it is like really like a lot of this stuff is not us, like IETF doing the things, right? There's a lot of policymakers in this space. And we had like really good set of policymakers come in. Like we had somebody from Tony Blair Institute, like who came in and they were talking about stuff. And we have people from like multiple like governments, like doing a lot of the regulation, they're all there. But and part of it is like our work is to educate and inform, right? Like, you know, what we're doing and kind of keep them informed all the time. So if you have somebody from the Indian government, like who kind of wants to look at this, right? Like, you know, and wants like a kind of high level summary of these things, we would love to see it. And also like come back and say like, hey, this is something I don't understand. This doesn't fit my purpose. All those kind of things is something we want to do as part of the working group, right? Like, because this is not something typically an IETF working group does, but we kind of want to have this kind of maybe a website or something that we maintain in parallel for people to have like high level, not totally correct summaries, right? Like which talk about like, hey, what is the things we're trying to accomplish and what we're not, right? I think that's something we want to do it. And also tell them these deliverables are coming, so they don't kind of go and start writing their own technical mechanisms. And we see this in other areas, right? Like, a lot of governments are doing like age verification and stuff without understanding the technical implications, right? So we kind of don't want to like go in the same path, like where the governments don't know there's like technical standardization stuff happening. So we kind of want to keep them informed while going forward. And we don't, as I said before, we don't have any enforcement mechanisms, but that's something we can probably look at a recharter once we deliver this and we see adoption. We can start looking at like what more needs to get done. And we also want to talk about like what the documents don't do, like, so because it's more important working with the regulator and policymakers that we are very clear what the documents don't do, right? And what they have to figure out whether they should do or figure out like what they need alternate mechanisms for. But that's something we kind of also want to communicate to make sure that we manage the expectations and deliver something that's useful for them. So if you're missing something big, we want to understand pretty early that we're missing it and try to work on it. So that's pretty much it on my presentation. Like, any questions?
There's a question from Odolfo, which is about, are we thinking this vocabulary as a flat list of terms, or is this something more structured, such an ontology is required?
Like for the early thing, really keeping it simple, but certainly there's like people. I have a Venn diagram on paper, right? Like when I look at it, it's not a clear hierarchy of things. So we started saying, hey, maybe this could be like a hierarchical thing. There could be AI, Gen AI, RAG, whatever, right? Like, but it doesn't lend itself very well to it. So this is really like more like a bunch of sets that are like partially overlapping and things like that. So right now we're just going to keep it very simple. So it's not going to be a structured like ontology and like a tree kind of structure kind of things, but we have to figure out like how we extend this. So we are starting off like very simple to like make sure we have it early out in the market as one of the things, right? And then we can actually look at defining. So the goal of the vocabulary is like the document is here, you look at it, and if you have some kind of use case that is like valuable, I think you should look at it, and if it doesn't fit it, like we would like to hear more, right? That there's like a GitHub issue list, but we are tracking the issues there, but like all the discussion is on the mailing list, right? Like, so you send out a mailing list saying, hey, this doesn't fit my purpose. This is what I'm trying to do, right? And like this vocabulary doesn't fit it, would be a really good start, right? Like to get the discussion kicked off. As I said, we are going towards simplicity. So a lot of the complex use cases, like one of them is the jurisdiction, like that came up, right? As like a thing we decided not to put in because it's unclear what that implies, right? Like, in the vocabulary, like, why would it talk about a jurisdiction? Because you could have a different crawler jurisdiction, a user jurisdiction, and even a content creator and content hosting jurisdiction, right? So it becomes pretty unclear how the jurisdictions get combined. So we decided we probably won't have it, right? Like it's still like open in the working group, but we kind of see it like more going towards not having it. When we are not sure if something should be there, it's not going to be there. Because that's a high level thinking on the process, right? Like, so where we try to only put in things we are sure we need it, if that answers your question.
Makes sense. Well, thanks. I totally get the idea that you need to start simple, right? I get that. There's a couple of concepts that you mentioned that are super important that might benefit from the structure. One is the extensibility, right? Eventually, you're going to bring a new stakeholder who only knows about some portion of the whole space and they want to contribute in that space. That's number one. And second, you mentioned something super important, which is conflict resolution, right? How can you mix and match different preferences that on the surface could be conflicting because they're targeting different stakeholders. So I totally get it. But just a thought, as the conversation progresses, structure may evolve or manifest itself. But great job, and I'm glad to see the discussion taking place. Thank you.
Like, and I'd love for you to just join the list, right? Like, so the AI control list, I have the link to the working group. So just join the list and post, right? Like, like everybody's welcome to contribute. That's how we make progress. Like, because we do know that even though we are trying to do kind of a roadshow, like we have like 3 continents, like, we had like Asia, Europe, and North America in there, right? We still haven't done like any kind of outreach in like South America or Africa, right? Like, so we would love to see participation. So I talked to a few policymakers like from Africa, but they're like 2 or 3 countries from Africa, right? It's, we had people from like Comoros, right? Like I spoke to somebody from the regulator from the Comoros about like, how like this thing works, right? But like, it's kind of hard for us to always reach out. So if you know somebody, like get them to come participate, you participate, just put in your issues. Like maybe they won't get fixed, but at least we know those issues exist, right? Like, so I think it's really, really good if you just participate.
Definitely. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Suresh, Priscilla further asks, what stage the working group is at right now, and how can an AI expert contribute to this work?
So 2 things. The working group is pretty new, as you know. Like we only had like 1 meeting until now. Other than the interim, we had a interim meeting, and we'll probably have 1 more interim meeting before Madrid, right? And have a meeting in Madrid, like more summarizing the thing. So it's very, very early, and the working group document just got adopted in April. So it's like a month old, right? The first working group document. So it's very, very early. But we want to get progress very, very quickly. So just like, if you're an AI expert, like I would think the biggest contribution would be to say, like, if something is too complex for you to obey, right? If you see us doing things that is very difficult for AI person to actually respect, I think that would be the biggest contribution you can say. So if you look at it and say like, hey, I'm doing something, I'm building a model, and these things are easy to do, these things are hard to do, right? I think one of the things we kind of got back from was the temporal thing, the time thing, right? What happens if a permission is like revoked, right? That's something we actually got from an AI person saying like, hey, what am I supposed to do at that point? And I think the high level answer would be like, next time you train the model, you take the latest one, right? That kind of high level thing. But I think the biggest contribution would be to check if it meets your purpose and if it's not too burdensome as an AI model creator.
And how are you currently running the interim meeting? The question was, are these meetings open? Is it easy to participate in this remotely? And Vinayak, you have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute and talk as well.
Sounds good. I'll answer you, Dhruv, first, right? So yes, it is an open interim meeting. So this is like a regular IETF meeting, announce an IETF list, and all it needs is a data tracker login, and we use Meet Echo. So if you look at the last set of meetings, like, we had like, so because of the way the IETF interim meetings are done, it cannot last more than 4 hours. So we had a 3-day interim meeting, and there's like 5 sessions on there, right? Like, it's counted as 5 interim meetings, but it's like 1. So you can actually go look at all the Meet Echo recordings from there, like the blue sheets, like everything like an IETF meeting. So everybody's like free to come and join. So no IETF registration, nothing required, just a data tracker login. So you're welcome to come and participate. Vinayak, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a question with regards to, like you mentioned, retrieval augmented generation or RAG, right? But when we are talking about training data, one is obviously, I think it's a great thing that temporal has come to mind, because once the model is trained and out there for inferencing, there is research where the model can be made to forget certain things, or there are ways in which you can add rules around a model to not answer maybe certain sources. But other than that, there are also other interactions that can be done with respect to models. For example, there are multiple stages that can be used. For example, once the model is trained, there can be some pre-training, there can be post-training. Also, what is also becoming very popular is fine-tuning of models. So even after the model is trained, I think it's possible to change the behavior, and this data can be used. So yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how this will fit in. Maybe I need to go back and read a little bit about what has happened in the group. But if you have any idea about if these different stages are addressed or discussed, that would be good to know.
So I would think the different stages are addressed. The temporal thing is more like a regulatory thing, right? Like, so when do you have to read this? Like, okay, first of all, I require to obey the preferences, right? That's already like a regulatory problem, right? Like, and how often are you supposed to check, right? Like, so like every time you do a model run, right? Like, do you have to go check or not, right? Like, or how do you check for freshness of your preference thing, right? So all those things are like more policy matters, right? Like you said, Vinayak, right? You can actually like do the like what they call guardrails, right? Like to say like, hey, this doesn't work, right? They don't answer this. But how often do you do it? Do you tell your model like, are you going to check everybody's robots attacks like every day, twice a day, right? Like every 5 minutes, right? Because there's also like a traffic thing on the internet that we need to worry about, right? So I think those are the things that probably the regulatory model is going to figure out. So as a high level thing, like not as like a working group person, right? I would think the only time is like, when you're doing like a whole pass of the training the model, you go and look at it and you kind of don't add it in, right? Because anything more real time than that, unless there's a regulatory need coming from the governments, like I don't think people are going to do it. Because it's certainly possible that some government could say like, let's say the Saudi government could say like, hey, like, every time you do like a response, you should go and check if you have permission to do the response, right? Like they could, right? It's very difficult for the AI model creator and they'll probably not obey. So that I think we have to find like a medium point, which is kind of like not too burdensome for people to obey and doesn't cost too much traffic on going on the website itself to do it, but also obey I would say the spirit of the preference, right? Like rather than kind of push for like, always being real time on this. But there's certainly companies who are working on registries that do real time queries. When you get a video, you go and query a registry and say like, do you have permission to do it, right? Like at that point when you're using it. So I think we're going to see the whole spectrum of this one, to be frank with you. Like,
Yeah, I don't want to rattle this discussion, but couple of one points. I think staying with the network analogy, I think one is one framework to consider would be something similar to DRM, that where you check whether you have a license, and at DRM the checking happens when certain asset is played or used or displayed. That is one model. But the other challenge is the way to look at model. There are two distinct phases, right? One is obviously the training, and the other part is inferencing. So once it's trained, it's like compilation, right? Like the binary is actually out there, and the model, again, the tricky model out there is like it's not like a cache, right? Because in a cache you can have this kind of cascaded preferences and rules about what should be shown, how fresh it is. But here you have like a binary, and then inferencing is not like in some sense like caching. So I think there's a lot of semantics involved in something like this. Anyway, I'll do
that
a
is
bit of
something.
yeah.
But that's something we'll certainly address, Vinayak, right? Like the difference between training and the RAG/inference thing is something certainly we want to address in the working group, right? Like at least that purpose would be separate. So that'll be something we will address for sure in the working group.
Cool, thanks.
Suresh, do you have any more slides?
I think just like some further reading if you want to go look at stuff, but other than that, no, I'm good.
Perfect. So off to you, Nalini.
No, so thank you so much, Suresh. A great, very interactive talk on a very timely topic. So I really encourage everyone to join the working group email list at a minimum so you can keep up on everything. There's a meeting coming up, an IETF meeting coming up in July. You can join remotely. If you cannot come in person, it's in Madrid. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you soon at our next webinar. Thanks again, Suresh.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Suresh. This was excellent.
Thanks all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suresh. Great
Thank
job.
you. Thank you,
Bye.
Nila.